Okay, welcome everyone to today's session on virtues and frameworks for space. We have four speakers, the first one being myself, but I will speak for a short period of time because we want to squeeze as much into the discussion and the question session as possible. If I'm speaking too fast or too Scottish, then do indicate this in the chat. I realise it can be a forbidding accent. Okay, so the basic idea is this. Part of the ethical tradition, not just of the West, but globally, for 2,500 years, has been discussion of character traits that we refer to various reasons to do with Cicero and Machiavelli as virtues, as character traits which some people would associate with promoting some kind of good, either a personal good or a societal good. And this is pivotal to ethical discussions within the military, but it's not been so central within ethical discussions concerning space. Indeed, from the philosophical discourse about the virtues, there has been a tendency to assume that virtue theory talk about the virtues, about these character traits, such as courage, justice, practical wisdom, and self-control or temperance, has a kind of application problem. So whereas some other approaches towards ethics, such as utilitarian approaches, consequentialist approaches, or deontological approaches which focus upon rights, it seems that virtue-based approaches don't give you quick and simple rules in order to tell you what to do. So a consequentialist might tell you, well, do whatever maximizes outcomes, and then you can end up doing some really, really dubious things that people normally wouldn't be prepared to do. Now, one thing about the move towards introducing more of the virtue discourse into the ethical discussion about space is the difficulty of identifying precisely what are the virtues that are relevant to space, and whether the virtues that the account of the virtues that are relevant to space is going to be shared everywhere. So are we going to have the same list of virtues in Japan and in Europe and in the US, or are we going to have something that's overlapping? There are certain accounts of the virtues that we probably wouldn't want to go for, any of us, because they would be incompatible with the best features of liberal democratic political systems. So they wouldn't promote the best features of that kind of system and any successor system which carries on those good features as well. I'm assuming right from the get-go that while there is a tendency for virtues such as courage, justice, practical wisdom, and so on to make our individual lives better, that a heavy weight has to be placed upon the way in which virtues tend to promote a societal good. So there are sacrificial virtues. There are virtues which will lead people to sacrifice their own personal interest in favour of the interests of others. Now, consider an example of a virtue, persistence. The Rosalind Franklin lander people have been trying to get that lander onto the surface of Mars for the last 2 decades, and they will do it maybe at the end of this decade, maybe at the start of the next decade. 3 decades of work, maybe a little bit more because there was some background planning as well. Now, persistence of that sort has to be a virtue. So in educational processes, in training processes, training people for space, telling them what is the stuff that you need, what are the character traits that fit now, persistence would be there. But persistence, again, has to be linked to good. It has to be linked to positive outcomes. It cannot just be stubbornness. So if you were on a project that takes 3 decades and has no prospect of a good outcome, that is not a virtue. That is just donkey-headedness. That's just an irrational, maybe not irrational, but certainly not a virtue. So I'll finish up with just a couple of things. There has been an attempt to bring virtue theory into discussions of space ethics from 2 different directions, one of which is relevant, but is not directly falling on top of the kinds of things that interest me about how virtue theory applies. There have been attempts to say that ideas such as terraforming show a lack of humility, and humility is a virtue, and that makes a great deal of sense, but it's not about the nitty-gritty immediate problems that we are facing in space in this generation and are likely to face in the next generation. So that's a discussion for people like me, philosophers, but it's not an applied discussion. And secondly, Jacques Arnaud, who did the first systematic work on space ethics. So if anyone tells you that someone else was the first serious space ethicist, someone other than Jacques, then ignore them because they don't know the history of the subject. Jacques was the first there. And Jacques proposed an interesting idea in a very short text called Impossible Horizon. And he said that confidence is an important virtue for space. But confidence in what? Is it confidence that's guided by practical wisdom? Or is it the confidence, say, of a madman? The confidence of a Nazi? The confidence of a jihadi? Or something of that sort? There's probably people who we don't want to be confident because the goals that they pursue are not conducive, leading to the societal good. So that's something that I certainly want to speak about as an interesting matter. And the final point that I want to make is that there is a ready-made discourse of the virtues which will be taken into space, and that is the military discourse of the virtues. So here I would recommend Nikki Coleman's Military Space Ethics. See, I did promise that I would put a plug in. I hasten to add this was at my request, not at Nikki's. So Military Space Ethics is an excellent place to start. But of course, there's going to be differences between the virtues which are relevant to the practice of science in space and the military virtues which are relevant to space, and the virtues which are relevant to the underpinning of both of these things with a commercially based infrastructure, which we know is now developing. Okay, I have been disciplined and I have kept to my 10 minutes so that others can jump in and have a full 15 minutes, and then we will go to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for a good introduction, Tony, and I would like to share my slide. Do you see my screen? Good. Okay, thank you. And today I would like to talk about the relationship between the various values and the notion of virtue. And so far I have published several papers concerning the notion of virtue in space. And today I would like to talk about a kind of virtue that I would like to call the cultural sensitivity. Okay. So today's content composed by the 3 sections and with conclusion. I don't think I have a time to refer to the additional information, but I'm happy to discuss about these topics as well. So it doesn't work. Sorry. Okay. So the advancement of space activities can have various influence on our society. Space settlement will lead to development of so-called extraterrestrial societies, such as the Moon Society, which can harm the natural environment on the Moon. The space resources mining will accelerate the commercial use of space, which may cause an economic gap between the spacefaring and the space-developing nations. And furthermore, the launching new space stations will realize the next stage of human space exploration, but can increase international conflicts concerning the national security issues between nations. Such possible harms, gaps, and conflicts are parts of the risks that future space activities may compel our society to bear. Accordingly, I think ethical, legal, and social issues of future space exploration must be explored to identify which risks we will be exposed to. In accordance with ELSI explored, responsible research and innovations must be promoted to mitigate these risks. Therefore, ELSI and RRI are inevitable considerations for ethically acceptable space exploration. This is my basic idea. However, I'd like to emphasize this point. It should be noted that risks are not as objective as they seem to be. It depends on society and culture, which factors are considered to be risks and to what extent. Because different societies and cultures have different value systems and traditions based on which they evaluate their surroundings. This subjectivity of risk perception becomes acute or obvious, especially when the influences of science and technology in question spread beyond borders. And since space activities are one of such sciences and technologies, their ELSI can also differ between society and culture. Of course, we share some basic concerns, but still, we may have a different perspective on the same topic or same possible harms. One example of this risk subjectivity can be found in the case of the space funeral business by using NASA commercial lunar payload services, in which a private company can commercially operate a NASA-funded spacecraft to deliver human remains into space. In 1998, one of such spacecraft crashed into the lunar surface with human remains aboard. Since tribal nations raised concern, NASA apologized and promised not to do that again without prior consultation with indigenous people and others. Namely, they also said that who are such people? They say that US tribal nations. NASA reports that the space agencies need to enhance cultural sensitivities to manage such risks. Another example is a cloud seeding experiment planned by Harvard University and the Swedish Space Corporation. An independent advisory board of ELSI assessed their experiment and finally reported that it should not be conducted, taking into consideration the voices of environmental groups, Northern European indigenous organizations, and other opponents. The board also recommended that the research team have an occasion to discuss this experiment with the general public before conducting it. These two examples highlight the subjectivity of risk perceptions, and this is an acute concern for space exploration because different people have different voices on which factors are considered to be risks for their lives and to what extent. So I think the ELSI and RRI of space exploration must be sensitive to such diverse voices from different societies and cultures. And so this is section 1, and I would like to move to section 2. So I'd like to share my idea that I would like to identify this sort of sensitivity as a virtue rather than the rules or guidelines. This is my basic idea. So taking these subjectivity risks into consideration, those who promote RRI and explore LC of future space activities will be required to have a sensitivity towards cultural diversity. Let us call this the virtue of cultural sensitivity. Having this virtue, one can notice, consider, and appreciate the voices of those who belong to other cultures. Such appreciation will enable them to develop a culture-sensitive list of LC and to promote RRI in an accordance way. I would like to articulate the three features of this virtue as follows. Feature 1. Culture sensitivity is not a single basic virtue, but an umbrella concept that consists of several epistemic and moral character traits. First, to be culturally sensitive, one must be open-minded to the voices of those who belong to other cultures. However, one must also be polite about his or her own culture, because an open-minded person will listen to others' voices, but may not incorporate such voices into consideration if the person considers his or her own culture as special. In this respect, the politeness in question will be connected to moderate patriotism or even the cosmopolitan mindset. The virtue of cultural sensitivity will need these traits as its component. Second feature is the manifestation of virtues. So it is compatible with the fact that each component can be understood as an epistemic or moral virtue. For example, cosmopolitanism itself can be considered an important virtue for the peaceful use of space. Still, these virtues need to be integrated under the umbrella of cultural sensitivity to develop a culture-sensitive list of LC. However, such integration doesn't mean that the virtue of cultural sensitivity is phronesis, which is usually understood as the highest unifying virtue in Aristotelian virtue ethics. Rather, this virtue, the virtue of cultural sensitivity, should be understood as a kind of, I think, manifestation of a combination of several virtues in the context of, but not limited to, space ethics. So the last feature, the virtue of cultural sensitivity can be realized in multiple ways. Although I list three traits, open-mindedness, politeness, and cosmopolitanism, the virtue of cultural sensitivity can consist of different components, or I think different degrees of similar components. This multiple realization of umbrella virtue can be empirically supported by a psychological report that different societies and groups can have different notions of the components of virtue, but still share the notion of virtue as the same thing. So this means that we should take a flexible attitude towards the notion of virtue and embrace the possibility of alternative virtues. And I need to emphasize this point because cultural sensitivity is usually not understood as a virtue, but I'd like to propose to consider this sort of trait as a virtue. Okay, so let me move to the final section, the practical implication. So such a flexible and multiple approach towards the virtue of cultural sensitivity will have practical implications for space ethics. I think I would like to point out one or two or maybe three implications. First, the appreciation of the virtue of cultural sensitivity can bring a certain change in research trends in space ethics. The authors of a recent survey of space ethics, Tony and Jim, and showed their perception of the current situation concerning space activities as follows. I'm showing the here. And they say it is rare that US space advocates ever had to grapple with non-US, non-European, and non-libertarian value system or ways of seeing the world. Here, it is worth noting that space advocacy in the past has had a tendency to marginalize the perspectives of women, persons of color, indigenous persons, persons from Africa, Asian, European, and Middle Eastern cultures, disabled persons, and members of the LGBTQIA community, blah, blah, blah. So, okay. Such marginalization is the other end of the spectrum of the very idea of the virtue of cultural sensitivity. Within the field of space ethics, however, the authors perceive a bit more positive change occurring as follows. To be honest, this is a bit from my own intuition, but Tony and Jim seem to have a bit more positive perception at the current situation of space ethics research. So anyway, I think this change must be accelerated. Indeed, we can find a few examples that intended to enhance the cultural sensitivities in the field of space ethics. For example, an edited volume collected voices from so-called marginal groups, edited by Schwartz, Billings, and Nesbold in 2023. And another example, that is my example, but another example, take a more historical approach and aim to show the different approach to space ethics by exploring that the Japanese space ethics have a different trajectory of development from that of the so-called West. However, the perspective of cultural sensitivity has yet to be sufficiently explored in the field of space ethics. In this respect, and Tony and Jim have a perspective that aligns with mine when they said examining a broader spectrum of human cultures and perspective is absolutely vital for increasing our confidence that we are doing the right thing for the right reason in the best way. And from the viewpoint of virtue ethics, what is important here is a notice that the righteousness, italicized, that I quote, and here, can be best achieved by cultivating virtue rather than making enormous kinds of rules or guidelines. Of course, I agree that we need some guidelines or rules, but at the same time, we need to cultivate some virtues that understand the spirit of the rules. Okay, the second implication is appreciation of the virtue of cultural sensitivity can update the RRI and ELSI assessment. A recent study, a recent study reports that RRI can be assessed by 6 key categories: gender equality, science literacy and education, ethics, public engagement, open access, and governance, with 36 indicators. Although some indicators of the public engagement category have a certain relationship with cultural sensitivity, the value of such sensitivity has to be declared more clearly because the public in the study remains ambiguous. The same problem can be seen in the case of environmental ethics. Or the Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration states the environment issues are best addressed through the participation of all interested citizens at each level. It remains uncertain who are the citizens in question. Remember that I mentioned in the case of space funeral business, NASA's report identifies prior consultation with indigenous people and others as that with US tribal nations. Given that space funerals can have an impact on every culture on Earth, consultation with the public within the US is insufficient as a consideration of cultural sensitivities. Therefore, from the viewpoint of the virtue of cultural sensitivity, the meaning of public should be clarified by considering the cultural diversity on Earth. So I would like to conclude my idea with two tips. For future space exploration, I think we must explore the following two things. One, developing a culture-sensitive list of LC for space exploration. And second, exploring the human virtues for future space exploration, and which can appreciate above-mentioned list of LC and the promotion of culturally sensitive RRI. Okay, that is my idea. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. If you could unshare the screen. Excellent. And we are shifting over to Nikki Coleman's presentation now. Thank you.
And I will just share my screen. So, Yama, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from today. I'm joining you from Canberra in Australia, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I think my presentation follows on very well for Koji, because I'm going to talk about an applied example of these cultural sensitivities. I'm an applied ethicist, and so my focus is primarily on that. And so my talk today is particularly for the scientists and the engineers who are here today. This talk is for you. My team is creating an applied space ethics framework to assist you with ethically analysing your work. And my dog has just decided to shake next to me, so if you hear her stretching, you'll understand why. So I'm looking, our team is looking at an applied space ethics framework to assist particularly people working in space operations to analyse your work, to find ethical risks for now and for future risks. But first, before I get to that, I'd like to speak about what we are basing our framework on, and it might be a bit surprising to you all. So in front of you on the screen, you have a photo of a gorgeous photo of the Milky Way and Uluru, and I'll be speaking about that in a moment. But I wanted to give you some pretty stars to have a look at. It's actually nighttime here in Australia, and I can see, it's a clear night, I can see beautiful stars outside my window, but I live in the city, so I can't see them as good as this. So I'm giving you this image. So recently, there's been some great discussion on the importance of making hearing Indigenous voices when we talk about space. And this makes me exceedingly happy. I'm not Indigenous personally myself, but some of my children are Indigenous, and I've been very lucky to learn from some Indigenous elders here in Australia. One thing I've noticed about the discussion within the space community about diversity and about hearing, particularly from Indigenous voices, is that these discussions have generally been quite theoretical, or they've focused on the origin storytelling part of the Indigenous relationship to space. Today, I'd like you all to broaden your horizons to not just think of Indigenous knowledge of space in just storytelling terms, but something that can help us examine how we use space now to help us identify the virtues that we highlight as important in the use of space when we create new space policy and law in particular. I'll be speaking from an Australian perspective, but I'd invite each of you to reach out to your local Indigenous elders wherever you are, all around the world, to sit and listen and learn what their understandings around space are. So when you think of Australian Indigenous culture, you often think of Dreamtime stories that tell you about the origins of life on Earth. But Australian Indigenous culture is so much richer than just this. Australian Indigenous peoples were the world's first astronomers. They've been using the stars to plan how they care for the land and how they travel for 65,000 years. One example of this is the emu in the sky. Much of Indigenous Australian astronomy relates not necessarily to the constellations themselves, but to the darker parts of the sky that make up in Australian Indigenous constellations. And the emu is one of these. We can see the emu in the Milky Way, and here we have a picture of the Milky Way over Uluru, and this is an example of the emu. We can see the emu in the Milky Way at different times of the year in different positions around the sky. In this picture, the emu is stretched across, obviously, Australia's most iconic rock, Uluru. If you look closely at the Southern Cross, and I will bring us forward one slide. If you look up to the right-hand side top of the slide there, you can just see the Southern Cross. And if you look closely at the Southern Cross, you can see the emu's head as a dark smudge tucked near the bottom left-hand corner of the constellation. Its neck passes between the two pointer stars, and its dark body stretches the length of the galaxy, being the Milky Way. At different times of the year, the emu is oriented so it appears to be either running or sitting down. And if you can't see the emu, let me give you, there's the emu. Once you see it in a dark Australian sky, you can't unsee it, but it's hard to pick out unless someone's shown it to you. So at different times in the year, it's either sitting or running. And depending on its position, the people, for example, in the Western Desert peoples of Central Australia, knew that it was time to hunt for emus, collect their eggs, or leave them alone. So this created, it created, I guess, a calendar in the sky that doesn't specifically relate to the seasons per se, as we experience them very differently in Australia, particularly in Central Australia. But rather it gave the Indigenous peoples knowledge to use in order to sustainably hunt emus and eat their eggs. This cultural knowledge also introduces us as modern people to the concept of caring for country. In simple terms, this is the idea that we as individuals and as a community, both locally and worldwide, have a deep connection to the land, the air, the sea, and the sky in modern terms being space. And with that connection also comes a deep responsibility to care for the earth and all that is on it and around it. The concept of country has many meanings in Australian Indigenous culture, and the word doesn't translate very easily into English. But one thing that unites these different meanings is a deep spiritual connection to country, to the earth, to the sea, to the sky. Country is Mother Earth who gives us life. If we don't look after country, life on earth will be sick, and as a consequence, we as humans will be sick as well. Similarly, Indigenous peoples in Australia talk about being on country, and this means being in your piece of the world where you're connected to your mob, your people, where you are intimately connected with the dirt under your feet or the water in the rivers or the oceans, the air we breathe in, and also connected to the stars. With this deep relationship to our earth comes a concept that roughly translates to caring for country. And this is applied in Australia into environmental things such as how we look after our natural resources. How do we care for country through farming practices, through water retention practices, and through mining practices as well? So caring for country is a responsibility for us to look after Mother Earth and sky, partly because of our link to past generations who came before us, but most importantly for future generations, that they also might too have a deep connection to country. And in this way, sustainability is inbuilt into the idea of caring for country. So caring for country is something that my research team are trying to integrate into the space ethics framework. using the concept of caring for country in an accessible way so that everyone can evaluate their ethical concerns and find the ethical risks of the particular space operation that they might be working on. So from the lawyer at the space agency where I used to work through to the junior engineer at a startup, we're hoping to give all people an accessible opportunity to examine the whole lifespan of a space operation and how they can enable a sustainable use of space for now and for future generations. It also looks at the concept of sharing space for all of humanity, not just for my country, but for all the people on the earth now and for future generations. And it's also tied to the idea of justice issues around who currently has access to space. What we found is that telling people to do the right thing in relation to space operations is not so effective at the moment, or punishing them when they do the wrong thing is problematic as well, because it's not seen to have a huge effect and seems to be a little bit short-sighted, but it's what we've got at the moment. So we're trying to look at broadening the concept of how we get people to look at ethical risk and encourage them to think sustainably for the future. So we're hoping that by tapping into this sense of belonging to country and with the stars and to space, we might encourage those people working in space operation fields to look beyond the next 2 to 5 years of profit and have a longer view of the impact of their space operations. We're hoping that by embedding the deep cultural concept of caring for country in an accessible space operations ethics evaluation tool, we need a better name. So if somebody has a better name, please let me know. That we might give a wider range of people an opportunity to have a voice, because diversity of voice in this space is really important. We're hoping that it might open up a wider range of people to have a voice in how space operations impact on our Earth and people here and in the future. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this and other questions as well. I was short so that we'd have time for questions.
All right. Do you want to run some questions just now, or
now or later? It's up to you. I was banking time for us.
Great, well done. Okay, then let's run on to Sarah, and then this will give us a good stretch for questions. Okay, Sarah.
Okay, I am sharing my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yep, they're up.
Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about legal and ethical considerations for private space activities. The themes I'm going to be covering are why do we care? Why do we care about ethics? As well as what are some fundamental concepts between law and ethics, and practical ethical issues regarding implementation. So my interest in ethics stems from an interdisciplinary background in seeking to understand what the values are or should be in underpinning law and policy, particularly in regards to novel space activities. First, it is important to note that laws function to protect values, thus they can represent the values of a society at any given point in time. But laws can also change, and they should change, to keep in tandem with the progress of society and emerging technologies and applications. And this is particularly relevant for the field of space, as spaceflight is deemed an ultra-hazardous activity. So we need to make sure that law is relevant and that it keeps pace with the evolving space operations and activities in space, whether they're conducted by governmental or non-governmental entities. However, law is not ethics, and sometimes laws and regulations may not be ethical. So we always need to evaluate both the underpinning values and the law or policy mechanisms used to enforce compliance with those values. Ethics, as the study of what ought to be done, which emphasizes the right action, should serve as the foundation for developing not only hard law, but also soft law, norms, and best practices. We can also utilize ethical analyses to test and calibrate existing laws and regulations to ensure that they are aligned with our stated values. Ethics becomes particularly relevant when we're looking at a gap in the law or regulation. And this gap might be intentional, like in commercial human spaceflight, to allow industry room to grow and develop and innovate without being stifled by restrictive regulations that could very quickly become obsolete. Or we just might not be there yet, such as a lack of regulation for certain novel in-space activities, like in-space manufacturing or commercial crew activities on board private spacecraft, perhaps even a private spacewalk. So where law is intentionally silent or lacking, it is important to look to ethics and analogous normative standards of care to fill in the gaps. And in the very least, ethical conduct may also serve to protect against claim for damages arising from negligence. From the international law perspective, we see space law as inherently principle-based and thus holds some ethical value. For instance, both the Outer Space Treaty and the geopolitical history surrounding the drafting of the treaty raise specific interests and concerns in the value of utilizing space for peaceful purposes, as well as for the benefit of humanity. Scientists have been some of the most consistent advocates for the preservation of space environment for scientific investigation. And as a matter of public policy, the United States, as well as the United Nations, also views space data and satellite applications as a public good. The Outer Space Treaty stipulates 3 particular freedoms of space: the right to use, explore, and conduct scientific investigation in space. But also it carries corollary duties of states regarding responsibility and liability to include international cooperation, non-interference, and liability for damage caused. So it's not far-fetched to expect these high-level principles and considerations to also trickle down and apply to private and commercial actors in space, both individually and collectively. To frame the questions of law versus ethics, we also need to understand the language and context in which the concept is used. So whether looking at a legal or ethical issue concerning a space activity, we have to compare, contrast, and distinguish each question through the disciplinary lens, knowing that law and ethics can utilize different language, has different objectives, forms, and significantly might render different outcomes. 3 key concepts here are distinguishing fact from ethical value from the law. Note that law governs 2 things in particular: actors and activities. And those actors might be natural, such as humans, organic life forms, as well as juridical entities. So this is corporations, institutions, organizations. But since no one can own space, no state or individual, then the law is not seeking to govern the space domain itself. So law is only looking at the actor and the activity. Whereas ethics may be concerned with the intrinsic value of the space environment itself. Ethics is also concerned with the moral conduct of persons, as well as all agents of moral concern, be they humans, non-humans, AI, or aliens. So just as an example. Now, this slide shows a flowchart on how ethics flows from idea to concept to norms and practice. Law is inherently an enforceable set of rules, but sometimes, and particularly in regards to space, because space is a very dynamic and changing field, implementing norms of behavior and incentivizing voluntary compliance with best practices is often more persuasive, and it also allows for the benefit of flexibility for appropriate boots on the ground implementation. Voluntary compliance also speaks to virtue ethics, which my colleagues have very articulately identified, and doing the right thing. And we do the right thing under ethics because it is the right thing to do, not because there's a penalty for non-compliance. That would be a legal issue. So implementing ethics into policy or law can also present challenges, however, when there are different schools of thought which can render differences in approaches, standards, or objectives for behavior. And Tony iterated some of these earlier. Here are 3 established schools of philosophy just as an examples: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. So if we want to implement practical ethical guidelines into our decision-making frameworks for space activities, and let's take the aspect of human spaceflight policy, for instance, which approach or what approach should we take? We know we want to preserve human life, but at what cost and to whom? What ethical approach is optimal or desirable when faced with novelty and uncertainty? And this concerns the scope of activity, also the inherent dangers of space and spaceflight, as well as the fact that there is no guarantee for mission success. That means there is no guarantee we will reach the ultimate good, which is the whole purpose of the activity. Depending on which philosophical school of thought you apply, you might just get a different answer. Now, the Institute of Medicine circumvented this challenge by identifying mid-level ethics for NASA regarding ethical decision-making concerning long-duration human spaceflight missions. And they settled on fundamental values that everyone could agree on. And the result were these 6 core values: a duty to avoid harm, a duty to uphold beneficence, a balance of risk and benefit, and a respect for autonomy, a duty to ensure fairness, and finally, fidelity. These same values can likewise be applied and implemented by the private sector in relation to launch operations and human spaceflight. However, it is up to industry to apply these ethical principles in their risk, safety, and decision-making metrics. There is no law or policy that requires this. This is a visual representation of ethical issues raised by various space activities to demonstrate the wide scope and reach of ethical concerns. We have everything from business to technology to law to medical ethics, astronaut ethics, as well as environment. This is the same information, but in list form, and note that each ethical question here may also invoke some corresponding legal issues. It's not always the case that law and ethics are raised, that there are unanimous issues raised on the same particular scenario, but in many cases with regards to space, because it's new and because it's uncertain, there is often overlapping interest, although they have to be evaluated separately. So in analysis, we must ask separate questions. First, if there is a relevant role. There may or may not be in regards to space, because again, space is dynamic and it's a relatively new area for activity, so it's not well established yet. Apart from established actions such as launch and re-entry and orbital satellite operations, there is not much regulated for new novel activities in space and commercial human spaceflight. So ethics has a role to play here, and both an ethical and legal analysis helps to inform us as to what values are at stake, leading us to choose one course of action over another. And ethics also helps to inform government as to what values require protection through regulation, or what ethical approaches should be considered for regulatory development. In short, anytime you hear X should be regulated, and as a lawyer, this is something I hear a lot, the first response should always be why. What is the vital interest here? For instance, is it public safety and welfare? But that is the interest of the public, not the interest of the actors. Or is it the lack of transparency and trust in industry to do the prudent thing, absent mandatory rules and compliance monitoring? It's also important to distinguish between ethical, legal, and socioeconomic issues. For instance, the minimum age for spaceflight participants is legally 18 years of age. Admittedly, this is a somewhat arbitrary number. Ethically, what is the distinction between a 17-year-old or a 19-year-old from an 18-year-old? On another note, does it make a difference if we target and mine an asteroid for helium-3, let's say for sustainable energy, versus an asteroid for diamonds? Legally and ethically, mining might be the issue, maybe not the target use, or maybe the target use is an issue. But definitely there will be socioeconomic impacts, so that would be a separate analysis. Do we need to develop policy and law to address these likely consequences? What analogous frameworks exist that we can adapt, adopt, or learn from? We have many legal and policy tools. We have soft law, we have best practices, recommendations, guidelines, protocols, many of which aspire to encourage right conduct without reinforcement. In addition, what else can we learn from history on imperial conquests, trade practices, which may have been unethical in the past, and long-distance corporations? How might we mitigate the risks for adverse patterns of individual or corporate behavior from repeating in the far depths of space away from immediate government oversight? Ethics is ultimately a tool for continued analysis, evaluation, and recalibration. It's not a one-stop, all-done approach. Just a few days ago, the Polaris Dawn mission conducted the first private crew spaceflight with a spacewalk. The media had a heyday questioning whether it was legal. The question really should be, why would we need to make spacewalks a regulated activity? The launch and re-entry was lawful, but spacewalks are not covered under the FAA legal mandate or any other US regulator or regulation at this point in time. But even if the US were to initiate regulation, what should or would that regulation look like? What are the values at stake here? Again, compare, contrast, distinguish. For instance, what is the difference between a private spacewalk with a governmental sponsored spacewalk? Is there a difference? If yes, why? If no, why? Is it about safety, about balancing individual rights of autonomy with the risk and benefit of the activity? Is it a socioeconomic concern about tapping the resources of the community to respond to the whims of the wealthy few? Is that a prejudice? Is it a concern that a private crew member might make a mistake with consequences? Perhaps they go on a walkabout to take a selfie and lose their camera to the orbital dynamics of space, which could then add to the growing volume of space debris and increased risk to other assets and individuals in Earth orbit. Is it a sustainability issue? There are so many issues that could be raised here. It's not clear. There is room for more thought and evaluation here. Now, there are many implications of, there's many activities to be conducted in space. There's many implications for the use and exploration of space. So I just highlight them here with regards to rights, economics, as well as environment. And I'm happy to discuss these more in the Q&A. I just wanted to highlight some of the key issues. So in conclusion, there are some takeaways that we can look at, and this is my practical ethical analysis. Consider what you're doing. Why should you do it? If you accept it, but then what will the consequences be? If there is a negative consequence, how might you mitigate that? Or what management plans can you put into place to evaluate and remedy those risks? Now, in a perfect world, there should be no need for law if everyone agrees that doing the right thing is the only desirable course of action. But in reality, we do need frameworks for guiding human action and addressing the implications of those actions. And this is particularly pertinent for space, as space can have broad reaching consequence, which can impact more folks than those just engaging in the activity itself. And an evaluation for the application of ethical law and governance is an inherently evolving process. Both government and industry is in need of informed guidance to help identify ethical values and devise implementable approaches to establishing these norms. When I did my PhD over 10 years ago, nobody was talking about ELSI. So it is very encouraging to see that there is recognition and discussions both at NASA, academia, and government in looking at the ELSI implications of conducting space activities. But this is still a rather new development. Lastly, we need to distinguish the ethical, legal, and socio-economic concerns raised in order to be able to adequately and appropriately understand and address each challenge. And we should not be ignorant in convoluting the issues. There are different interests and different implications to each evaluation. Not all issues are ethics-centered. Not all legal questions are ethical quandaries either. Moreover, some issues may be merely preferences or societal trends that reveal the evolving nature of humanity, while other actions will trigger undeniable socioeconomic developments, whether beneficial or detrimental. Do all activities and issues arising require regulation in space? Maybe, maybe not. This is part and parcel of the ongoing evaluation for determining the right or optimal course of action in the exploration and use of space, whether it's conducted by governmental or non-governmental entities. And I will conclude there.
Okay, great. Right. We have a question in the webinar chat, which is from Chad Schlesinger, which is, if we decide to take the, I'll read it out and then capture the thing. If we decide to take the virtues of justice and acceptance into space with us, is there some way to preserve the highly valued Western value of autonomy? It seems as if Dr. Tachibana's methodology would begin to address this through open-mindedness. However, I fear that by focusing on protecting identity rather than general inclusion, we run the risk of bringing the old intersectional problems with us? What if Earth identity was made anathema in space? My apologies to Dr. Coleman. So to me, the bit that's doing the main question work there is I fear that by focusing on protecting identity rather than general inclusion, we run the risks of bringing the old intersectional problems with us. So the whole question of a cosmopolitan vision of things versus the idea that we have to, in some sense, have a constrained and ethically shaped version of patriotism seems to be in play there. Who would like to field that first? We can run through all of us, but people who are listening in should send questions in one format or another. I will find them.
At the moment, a lot of our space operations are very nationalistic. We have NASA, we have the Australian Space Agency, we have the European Space Agency. Even the ISS has modules that belong to each country. And so identity is very much how we've done space has very much been framed in those terms. I hate to say this, but maybe commercialization of space changes that. Although maybe it goes from being nations to how much money you have. I think the idea of inclusion is actually vital, whether it's talking about policy, whether it's talking about law, whether it's talking about ethics, or whether it's talking about who should be going into space. Should it only be able-bodied male pilots who are 6'2" who have been a test pilot, or should we be having disabled astronauts who have been an amputee? I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure why I got an apology.
In fairness to the small people of the world, such as myself, some of the Gemini program and early Apollo people were about my height, which is not big. But if you go to the Smithsonian and see Gagarin's outfit there, small. Okay, Coach, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. In my presentation, I advocate the role of virtue, but if I try to be a bit more realistic, I need to be cautious, or I have to understand the limitation of this notion. Let me share only one slide, and I think can we harmonize different voices, values, perspectives? Then if not, then it might be possible that the space exploration necessarily is a kind of manifestation of some sort of vices, such as arrogance or the sense of superiority of spacefaring nations, or kind of nationalistic mindset. So, but the problem is, I think that even if we may not find the ideal point of compromise of the different voices, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have such virtues. I think having virtue can help us to correct ourselves, control, and make a limitation of our behaviors. So in this sense, I would like to say the virtue is not all around, but still useful. In this sense, we may have to develop the rules, guidelines as a kind of international settings, but still I'd like to push the perspective of virtue, but at the same time, I'm not sure whether we should keep the Western values that it said, the autonomy or something like that, and the notion of justice. So I think that we might be able to think about the alternative views on the notion of virtue that may help us to understand who we are and who we ought to be in the age of space exploration. In this respect, okay, let me just share an advertisement. And we are going to publish the books on the notion of alternative virtues. That this will be released at the end of this year, the January the next year. So if you're interested in having the new perspective on the virtue, I'm happy to get one in the library, anywhere we find. Yes, thank you. That is my idea.
Great. Sierra, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add from a practical perspective, I think it's important to identify the concept of those virtues and what those traits are. In practice, you're going to be looking at enforcement of that virtue. So if I hold the right to autonomy, but maybe somebody else holds a competing trait or virtue, I think it's important to note that what I'm really looking at is the right to have my concept of autonomy respected. But rights do not exist in a vacuum. First of all, they are a justifiable demand. And secondly, if I hold the right, I have to respect that other people hold that right. I'm not unique in that regard, right? That would be preferential treatment or even discrimination. So how I apply my perceived rights, or whether ethical or legal, is also going to have to correspond to other ethical right holders. And we see this a lot in regards to space applications, right? I can have the right to go explore space, but if somebody else wants to go there at the same time in the same spot, then that has to require some kind of negotiation, or maybe it is like a first come, first serve. So there are practical applications. The other thing too, I would just throw out, and just to play devil's advocate a little bit, is maybe we need to rethink some of our perceived notions of rights on Earth. So for instance, we have the concept of right to fresh air on Earth. Even prisoners have a right to fresh air. Now go to Mars and tell the planet you have a right to fresh air. It doesn't make sense. Or even tell your fellow colleagues that are sending you there, you have a right to fresh air. Is it recycled air? Is it just air in general? Right? So maybe some of our ethics are going to have to change based on the difference of the space environment. So again, looking at right and right holders and how do we harmonize that? And what are those actual rights that we hold or perceive to be true?
Great. I love that. I love that example. And the fact that you also put Chewbacca on the screen
Yes.
on 2 occasions, not just one, but 2. Okay, so a concern from Coach there that he's developing in the Virtue Ethics book that comes out in January and will be an excellent read for everyone to purchase. And a concern from Sarah there about taking unrealistic or unhelpful ethical norms and standards into space. And I can see that absolutely. So if we, for example, want to have a conception of autonomy, which in its modern attenuated form is really, it doesn't run that deep. It's very, very modern. It's who are you to tell me what I should do? Well, sometimes the answer to that is someone who knows better, or someone who knows that you're going to kill yourself, someone who knows the systems when you do not know the systems. So yeah, I can see that. And as well, if we're thinking about a manageable combination of patriotisms on the one hand and cosmopolitanisms on the other hand, that's never going to work if we try to run with a conception of autonomy in space, which then collapses, and your only alternative is some much more authoritarian system, because you've run with super standards of autonomy and they do not work in space. They do not work on Mars. They do not work in the ISS. Down here at the local engineering works, you can decide to stop labour. I'm no longer working. You can't do that on the ISS.
Oh, they have had a strike in space.
Yeah, but
Sorry,
but not in terms of in terms of performing tasks which are non-essential to the survival of the rest of the crew. I'm guessing, yeah. That's the one. Yeah.
it was on Skylab.
Ah,
Skylab 3. Yeah.
So again, it's a balance rather than it might be a value that's useful, especially if you're thinking in terms of the cultural sensitivity, because certain articulations of Western traditions, not all, because it's a much more Protestant value than it is a Catholic value, for example. Autonomy is, yeah. So it kind of matters, but it cannot be an overriding conception of autonomy. A survival would seem, in many contexts, more important. Okay, I'll run to Aniko's question. Is space exploration a commercial, technological, and security necessity? Outer Space Treaty allows sharing but not ownership, and notes that the Skylab crew was overworked without adequate rest. So you know more about that. Annika knows more about that. So do we need to, I mean, we're talking about the virtues and the ethics, but do we need to do this thing? Or is it a done deal that we're, yeah. Should we run in the reverse direction? Start with Sarah this time.
I think this is the age-old question, why go to space, right?
Yeah.
I think there are so many different approaches to this question, both ethical and legal and practical. I don't know that it's always worth rehashing the same question when we're already engaging in space. So maybe to me, as a practical-minded person, I would say, okay, well, regardless of whether, like, for instance, a lot of people will disagree with mining or exploiting space resources. I might philosophically or ethically agree with that. However, the matter of the fact is companies are doing this and governments are allowing for this to go forward because there are socioeconomic benefits as a result of doing this. Now, obviously, with any action, there's always the chance for a negative implication as well as a positive implication. So if this is the way forward, maybe we should be addressing what is the prudent way forward. And if we do X, then what? As opposed to should we actually be doing this? Because the matter of the fact is it's already happening.
Excellent. And if anyone wants to know what space exploration is for, then Coach and myself are working on a short book on that, which should be out at some point in the mid or late next year. We have a question from, and I will shift to that rather than bringing in all the panelists to make sure that all the questioners get priority in this section. Now, Caitlin asks, sometimes contamination on the lunar surface is unavoidable. For example, dust plumes from landing vehicles. So it would be interesting to see how these ethics frameworks could be molded to unavoidable environmental conditions. Do the speakers have any further comments on this? So how do we shape to environments that we just have to live with? Nikki, do you want to?
Oh, so I just saw Anko. I'd like to chat with Aniko. The comments she's got, they have coming through is awesome. Tardigrades, yes. I think with ethics, it comes down to mitigating the risk. And so if we are going to go to the moon again, which we are, then we need to mitigate the risk as much as possible. So where it comes to unavoidable contamination, we need to go to every length that we possibly can to protect the space environment. Because when we think about space as an environment, it's actually very fragile. And we've done such a bang-up job on Earth that we need to do a better job in space and on the moon and Mars or wherever we go. And so my thinking is we need to be very thoughtful about how we mitigate the risks for now, but also for second and third order effects for the moon, but also for bringing stuff back to Earth as well, which we already do pretty well. But we need to be more careful about how we're going to do operations in space. And I mean, that not only goes for the moon, it also goes for space debris. Sarah was talking about the selfie camera, which is great. My favorite, you shouldn't have a piece of favorite space debris, but I do, but it's the astronaut's glove. How do you leave a glove? I mean, there are reasons, but, we need to be more thoughtful about how we mitigate risks. And my concern is, some of the big space agencies do this really well. My concern is, are some of our commercial operators cutting corners so they're not actually mitigating that risk? And that's where I think we need to be, as a group, making decisions about that, but also legislating or regulating for that. I'll over to everybody else.
Coach, do you want to come in on this? Or will I bounce it on to something else? Coach?
Oh, yeah, okay. And yes, I agree with Nick, and I think the contamination is one consideration. It has a value, and we have to pay attention to it, but it's not absolute value. So what is important is to be thoughtful, to be careful. That is everything. We need to handle the very complex situation, and we need to have such kind of faculty, and I would call it virtue, to manage very diverse values. That is my answer. Yeah. So there's no simple, easy way to solve this problem, but that is very important to notice it. Yeah. Thank you.
I can add one other thing too. I noticed somebody was talking about the Coast Guard guidelines. I think it's important to note, though, that the Coast Guard guidelines for planetary protection and as applied and implemented through national space agencies is scientifically oriented. So it's not about ethics per se. It's not about the intrinsic value of that planetary body or that celestial body. It's about how do we conduct good science. So that planetary policy might have a good ethical outcome, but the rationale and the approach is going to be different. Also, we have legal issues with regarding the environment, and I can just say this is very complex, especially at the international level, because while we have the Outer Space Treaty in Article 9 that deals with non-contamination of space and Earth from space, at the same time there is no liability for harming the moon, for instance, because the moon is not a party to any of the treaties, right? So again, going back to the rights, it has to look at who has agreed to take on these responsibilities, and the natural environment has not consented because it's not an entity to do so. So therefore, you could cause damage on the moon, and it might be seen as a breach of a treaty obligation if you're a party to that treaty, but it's not a crime. However, Belgium just recently, a couple of weeks ago, is looking at creating the first criminal code for environmental damage. But that's purely Belgian law, and it will be very interesting because they have a stipulation that will apply to space. But nobody else has done this, so that'll be very, very interesting to see a practical implementation in a legal framework.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Now we have just 3 minutes left so that we finish at a neat time slice before other sessions. The one thing that I wanted to pick up on was the way in which Nikki in Code appealed to thoughtfulness. And that certainly is really quite important in terms of how we form an account of the virtues that we need for space. Because one of the things that a good agent, a virtuous agent, would need, and here that's very important because one of the features of virtue theory that it tends to look at character, and to understand that you really need good exemplars of what's a good agent in any context. And that's difficult just now because we haven't been in space for long enough to develop good models of character. But one of the things that they will need is thoughtfulness in a very specific sense, especially if you're navigating this multicultural environment where you need cultural sensitivity. And that is the ability to distinguish between shallow issues and really deep issues. This is not my brilliant idea. This is Hannah Arendt. What are the disagreements that we have which run really deep, and what are the arguments that we have which are about really quite trivial matters, without assuming that every time we disagree that there must be some fundamental ethical principle behind it, often just a shallow issue. Would anyone like to make a closing comment before we wind up?
My pitch is that every space operations group has an ethicist or has somebody who goes and does some ethics training. Please not a 2-hour online course. Please look at it a little bit more in depth. But it actually saves people money because you're looking at ethical risk. And so we have a lawyer. Let's have an ethicist as well. I'm retiring, so it's not going to be me. But we need more ethicists, and we can all learn more about ethics. And I think we need to put more ethics into space. So thank you.
Okay, I would just like to thank Kinjo, who is the conference host and who is the person who's sort of made sure that we're all online and here at the right time and went to the right website and so on. So thank you, Kinjo, for doing that. And thank you for the the other panelists, and it's time to just close the session out. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you for
evening.
everybody contributing to the discussion. We will have a 4 minutes break before next session and see you later. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.